World War III feels closer than ever, and NATO needs to be ready for it. The alliance is preparing for every eventuality, and while Russia is the most obvious and aggressive enemy at the moment, NATO nations are also keeping a close and wary eye on China, where the world's largest land and naval forces are being assembled. A two-front war could break out sooner than expected, even as early as 2027. That's according to General Alexus Grynkewich, Commander of the United States European Command and Supreme Allied Commander Europe. Speaking at a meeting of military and defense industrial leaders at the Rhine-Main Conference Center in the German city of Wiesbaden, Grynkewich said that NATO needs to acknowledge and prepare for the very real possibility of both Russia and China launching wars at the same time. He suggested that Xi Jinping, the president of China, could coordinate a strategically timed strike with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, with China invading Taiwan at the same time Russia marches into one of the Baltic states or Finland.
The thing Xi's probably going to do before he decides to go across the Taiwan Strait is give his friend Putin a call and ask him to help. That to me means that both of these things could happen together. We're going to need every bit of kit and equipment and munitions that we can in order to meet that.
Grynkewich went on to add that this could all occur in less than 2 years, giving NATO precious little time to prepare. For now, arguably the alliance's best move is to continue supporting Ukraine as much as possible in order to keep the Russian army pinned back. If Ukraine can keep on resisting, delaying Russia's progression and taking out valuable pieces of Russian hardware, that will all make it much harder for the Kremlin to pursue any sort of secondary invasion into NATO territory. To that end, Grynkewich claimed that NATO is working hard to deliver more Patriot missile systems into Ukraine, bringing a big boost to the country's air defense capabilities. The US Air Force General said,
"I'm not going to reveal to the Russians or anyone else the exact numbers of weapons that we're transferring or when those will happen. But what I will say is that preparations are underway."
Grynkewich added that he'll soon be meeting with military leaders from across NATO to discuss additional ways in which the alliance can continue ramping up its support for Ukraine, especially in terms of air defense systems like interceptor missiles to counteract the near constant threat of Russian drone and missile strikes. Almost every day now, without fail, Russia launches drones and missiles over the border, targeting dozens of different towns and cities across Ukraine. June alone saw well over 5,000 drone attacks in total, demonstrating how ruthless and relentless the Kremlin's aerial bombardments have become. Thanks to air defense, Ukraine is able to bring down many of the drones quickly and efficiently before they have time to strike their targets. Unfortunately, Russia is adapting. It now deploys dozens of so-called decoy drones to soak up pressure and waste Ukrainian air defense resources, before later firing its real offensive drones and cruise missiles, which then have a stronger chance of dealing real damage. This sadly is one of the reasons why Ukraine has seen record levels of civilian casualties in 2025 so far. And with the numbers of drones and missiles rising by the week, Ukraine needs all the air defense support it can get. It's been working hard to develop its own systems, like AI-powered Sky Sentinel machine gun turrets that can lock on and take out drones with ease, while also taking deliveries of other systems and supplies from its allies. The fresh batch of Patriot batteries and missiles, supplied by the US but paid for by NATO allies, represents a huge boost, and Grynkewich confirmed that speed is of the essence.
We're going to move as quickly as we can on this.
He was speaking at the 2-day US Army Land Euro Symposium event, with many defense industry leaders and vendors in attendance, showing off their latest and greatest weapon systems. There, Grynkewich also spoke alongside US Army General Christopher Donahue, who currently serves as the Commanding General of the US Army Europe and Africa, as well as Commander of Allied Land Command. Both men call for closer and more efficient collaboration between military forces and defense industry companies. They also stress the need for companies to develop systems more quickly so that they can be deployed onto the battlefields of Ukraine and elsewhere around the world with minimal delay. The two leading US military minds also warned against the prospect of seeing Russia and China as two distinct and separate threats. Instead, they argue, a global approach is the most effective form of deterrence, with NATO nations urged to seriously consider the combined threat of Russia and China for peace and stability around the world. Grynkewich summed up by saying,
each of these threats that are out there cannot be viewed, in my estimation, as discrete challenges. We've got to think about how all of them are aligning.
Despite only assuming his new position as Supreme Allied Commander Europe on July 4, Grynkewich is keen on not to waste any time settling in. He's eager to take immediate action, stating that one of his top priorities for now is ensuring that NATO allies keep up with their recent pledges to increase defense spending to 5% of gross domestic product. At this time, some nations are far ahead of others in this department. Poland, for example, is leading the way and already spending over 4% of its GDP on defense. The Baltic nations are also performing well, undoubtedly due to the fact that they're among Russia's most likely targets to invade. Lithuania is around 3%, with Latvia at 3.2% and Estonia at 3.4%. Other nations, however, are lagging behind. Some have not even reached the 2% spending target, like Italy, which currently spends 1.5% of its GDP on defense, and Spain sitting at just 1.3%. Grynkewich will, without doubt, be keeping a close eye on those spending statistics and actively encouraging some of the poorer performing nations to step up to the plate and play their part. He also wants to make sure that defense budgets are spent correctly and appropriately, while continuously reminding NATO nations of the ever-present and ever-growing threat that Russia and China pose.
Time is of the essence, and I intend to keep highlighting that and letting everyone know that we've got to move out and we've got to move quickly.
The prospect of Russia and China working together to target the Western world grows larger as the war in Ukraine rages on. While many countries around the globe have condemned, shunned and sanctioned Russia since the invasion began, China has moved in the opposite direction, drawing closer to the Kremlin in various ways. For example, while Beijing hasn't directly supported Moscow in the war, trade between the two has surged since the war started. In 2024, for example, total trade between China and Russia reached approximately $245 billion, which is more than double the amount from 2020. This is largely due to the aforementioned sanctions and the fact that many nations across Europe have taken steps to massively reduce their reliance of an investment in Russian coal and oil. Needing to counteract its economic losses, Russia turned to China, and China was more than willing to pick up the slack, pouring record amounts of money into the Russian economy. This in turn has strengthened the burgeoning bond between the nation's leaders, Putin and Xi. The two men share a common distrust of the West and a desire to weaken Europe and the US by whatever means necessary. Both also clearly seek to expand their spheres of power and influence, forcefully taking over territories they feel should belong to them. For Putin, it's Ukraine, which he recently claimed belonged to Russia, arguing, "I've said it before, Russians and Ukrainians are one people. In this sense, all of Ukraine is ours. There's an old rule that wherever a Russian soldier sets foot, that's ours." For Xi, it's Taiwan, who said something very similar about Taiwan. "The people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait are one family. No one can sever our family bonds, and no one can stop the historical trend of national reunification." Both men, despite leading two of the largest nations in the world, are still desperate for more land, more power, more influence. It's what drives them, and if they see an opportunity to aid one another in getting what they want, they're likely to take it. Indeed, the idea of Russia and China striking simultaneously is something that NATO has been considering for quite some time now. A recent report from the German newspaper Bild revealed that the German government is fearful of an imminent Russian attack on one of the smaller NATO nations like the Baltics. According to the report, Russia may prefer to strike sooner rather than later, as the Kremlin feels that countries like Germany and other big European states won't be seriously ready to defend themselves or commit to full-scale war until 2029. Because of this, current members of the German government are said to be expecting some sort of attack as early as 2027. NATO's Secretary General, Mark Rutte, also recently warned of a possible impending attack from China and Russia. During an interview with the New York Times, Rutte was asked about the importance of NATO nations committing to the 5% defense spending target. He answered,
"We have an enormous geopolitical challenge on our hands. And that is first of all Russia, which is reconstituting itself at a pace and a speed which is unparalleled in recent history. They are now producing 3 times as much ammunition in 3 months as the whole of NATO is doing in a year. And don't forget, Russia is only the size of the economy of Texas, 2 trillion, and the whole of NATO is 50 trillion. So this is unsustainable. But the Russians are working together with the North Koreans, with the Chinese and Iranians, the mullahs, in Ukraine, in fighting this war, unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. So here, the Indo-Pacific, your Atlantic are getting more and more interconnected. We know that China has its eye on Taiwan. Given this whole geopolitical setup, there is no way we can defend ourselves if we would stick to this old 2%.
He was then asked about a prospective attack on a Baltic nation like Estonia and how NATO would respond.
We have all the plans in place that if Estonia will be attacked, and the Russians know this, that our reaction will be devastating. And I cannot go into all the details, of course, because Putin, I know, is watching these programs. But of course, we have to make sure that we not only have those plans, but we also have the people and the military gear to back it up. And this is exactly why we need to spend more. But it's not that the Estonians are left to themselves. It will be the full force of NATO, with its 800 F-35s here in Europe, with all the NATO Navy and landmass capabilities, including the full backup of the United States, which will come to the rescue. Putin knows this. This is why he will not attack Estonia today.
Then, in perhaps his biggest statement of the interview, Rutte spoke of the threat of Russia and China striking together, in words very similar to those used more recently by Grynkewich.
Let's really be not naive about this. If Xi Jinping would attack Taiwan, he will first make sure that he makes a call to his very junior partner in all of this, Vladimirovich Putin, residing in Moscow, and telling him, hey, I'm going to do this and I need you to keep them busy in Europe by attacking NATO territory. That is most likely the way this will progress. And to deter them to do this, we need to do 2 things. One is as NATO collectively being so strong that the Russians will never do this. And secondly, working together with the Indo-Pacific, something President Trump is very much promoting, because we have this close interconnectedness working together on defense industry, innovation between NATO and the Indo-Pacific.
While it's certainly a worrying prospect, it's easy to understand the logic behind this move. If China or Russia decided to act independently, they'd undoubtedly have a much harder time achieving their objectives. If Russia suddenly sent troops over the border into Estonia or Latvia, for example, the full force of NATO would rain down upon it, just as Rutte said. The US and its allies would follow Article 5 of NATO's North Atlantic Treaty, which states that any armed attack against one of its members is treated as an attack on the entire alliance. All member nations would respond, focusing their entire efforts and resources on countering Russia. And even with the huge army he's amassed, Putin would seriously struggle to make any gains with the full force of the US military and other strong NATO nations in his way. Similarly, if China chose to target Taiwan at long last, it would likely face some strong resistance. It's hard to see which countries would get involved and leap to Taiwan's defense, but the US would likely be among them. America could also call on its strongest allies to support it. If so, even with the world's biggest army and largest navy too, China would have a hard time achieving its aims. However, if Putin and Xi work together and time their strikes just right, it could be a very different story. Imagine, for example, if Russian troops rolled into Estonia and mere days later, Chinese warships surrounded Taiwan. Suddenly, instead of only having one major conflict to contend with, the US and the rest of NATO would have 2 huge fronts to focus on in completely different parts of the world. Battles would erupt across Europe and Asia, and NATO would have to rapidly respond, identifying its top priorities and dividing its forces accordingly to counter both emerging threats. This inevitably would be a huge challenge, and NATO would by default be significantly weaker as a result of having to split its forces in that way. That would, at least in theory, make it easier for Russia and China to push on, relying on the massive strength, resources and readiness of their respective armies to strike, achieve their arms, weaken the West and tighten their stranglehold on key pieces of land. That in turn could lead to one of the biggest shifts in geopolitics since the days of the Second World War. The potential timing of China and Russia's combined strike also makes a lot of sense. The two countries have made major investments into their militaries in recent years. Russia has been forced to do this in order to both launch and sustain its invasion in Ukraine and manage the heavy losses it suffered. It's lost thousands of tanks, armoured vehicles and other important pieces of military hardware, as well as suffering more than 1 million casualties. However, the Kremlin has sought to solve those problems by ramping up production of new tanks and drones, as well as beginning a major recruitment drive, offering financial incentives, and even resorting to blackmail and intimidation in some cases to get more men to enlist in its army. China, meanwhile, has seemingly been preparing for war for quite some time. Its defense spending has considerably increased year after year, with a lot of money being poured into its naval forces. With an estimated 234 warships, plus missile-armed corvettes and patrol boats, dozens of destroyers, 3 aircraft carriers, over 60 submarines, and additional support ships, bringing the total active fleet to more than 370 vessels. The Chinese Navy is a veritable force to be reckoned with. And given that both countries are in relatively strong positions, with Russia actively fighting and China more war-ready than it's been in years, it will be logical for the pair to strike soon. Because they can see NATO growing stronger. They know that Western nations, particularly in Europe, are finally starting to increase their defense spending, build their militaries, and improve their defenses. But they also know that it will take time for many of those nations, including major powers like Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, to truly attain their objectives and construct forces that are ready to fight in a sustained full-scale conflict. If they strike soon, China and Russia may feel that they have a clear advantage, a head start over many of their prospective opponents. Of course, they will still have to contend with the US, which is by far the biggest military power in the world and significantly stronger than either Russia or China. They'd also face strong resistance from the more prepared nations of NATO like Poland, Finland and the Baltic states. However, it would still be easier from a Russian and Chinese perspective to face off against a full-strength US and a variety of other NATO nations with varying levels of preparedness than to have to face NATO at its very best, with every nation fully armed, modernized and ready for battle. Russia and China are the second and third strongest military forces in the world today. While they lag behind the US in many areas, they both still have plenty of power, whether that be at land, sea or in the air. Russia, for example, has around 1.3 million active duty military personnel, with Putin hoping to reach 1.5 million through drafts and recruitment drives. It also has gigantic land forces, even taking into account the losses in Ukraine, with thousands of tanks, over 130,000 armoured vehicles, and thousands of self-propelled towed and rocket artillery units. It also boasts the third largest navy in the world, with its own aircraft carrier and strong numbers of destroyers, frigates, submarines, patrol vessels, mine warfare ships and corvettes. In the air, it's got the second largest force, with over 4,000 aircraft, including more than 800 fighter jets, over 1,650 helicopters and more than 550 attack helicopters. China, meanwhile, has over 2 million soldiers in its army, with more than 500,000 more waiting in reserve. On land, it has a colossal tank fleet, with an estimated stock of 6,800, plus over 144,000 armoured vehicles and thousands of artillery systems. It has a powerful air force too, with over 1,200 fighter jets and hundreds of helicopters for a grand total of 3,309 aircraft. And that's not to mention the strength of its navy, which has already been discussed. Both nations are nuclear powers too, with China possessing hundreds of nuclear warheads and Russia having the largest nuclear stockpile in the world today. Should the two choose to team up, there's no doubt that they would prove to be the biggest combined threat to global peace and stability since the days of World War II. NATO needs to be ready for that. The future of the world depends on it. Thankfully, under strong leaders like Grynkewich, the alliance is upping its game. Countries are spending more and improving their military readiness by the day, eating away at any advantage Russia and China might have. So if or when the day finally comes for those two to strike, NATO nations will strike back harder than they could ever imagine. Now, learn more about how NATO is gearing up to combat Russia with our recent look at the alliance strategy to capture the Russian territory of Kaliningrad. Or check out our breakdown of how US B-2 bombers could give Australia the edge it needs to deter Chinese aggression in the Indo-Pacific. And finally, make sure you subscribe to our trusted news channel too for more day-by-day updates and detailed strategic breakdowns of ongoing and potential conflicts around the globe.